someone came into the studio once and they were like, "Can you make like CD quality music?" And I was like, "Yeah, I'm gonna say that."
We have a plug-in for that.
Yeah.
Hi.
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 How are you?
I'm good.
I'm just processing that.
I know that was kind of like this whole 20-year thing is kind of caught me off guard a little bit.
What
Same.
do you mean?
Well, it's just, part of what got us to 20 years, I think, in the first place is that we didn't keep stopping and looking back, And I think then you kind of just one day you wake up and there's a bunch of emails that are like, "Hey, we're going to celebrate your last 20 years." And you're like, "Oh, whoa." First of all, I didn't know it was 20 years. And second of all, I'm not sure I needed on that day to start drawing a connection between everything I've ever done and how it resulted in me sitting in this chair right now. It's kind of like being at your own funeral, not at your own funeral, but like the thing where like everyone talks about you and, it's like your own.
It might be more like a roast.
Yeah, maybe your own roast.
Yeah, it's a trip.
It's been a trip.
It's been really cool. The combination of going back to Old World and I think what made it more intense actually is that it's not like it happened in a vacuum of like we were inactive and was sort of like, hey, remember 20 years ago?
Yeah.
Instead, it was Old World right up against Formentera II and the eerie sensation that for all the things that have happened in our lives personally and creatively and everything, it was like, we're exactly the same.
I'm excited to get a chance to talk a little bit about the early days of the band, but I think I even want to go back a little bit further and talk about the early days of each of you. And Emily, I'll start with you. Talk to me a little bit about like how your creativity, how you found your creativity in yourself. My understanding is that it's your family, right? It's your folks.
Yeah, I mean, it's the culture and mythology of every family is unique.
Mm-hmm.
Mine, it was interesting because there are no other musicians in the family, but there's a deep appreciation of music. And, it doesn't take me long to speak of my father, who was a poet. He was also a French teacher, much beloved, and showed a lot of people from Canada, Paris for the first time, which I think is a very cool accomplishment.
Like took people on trips?
Yeah, he did. Like he had to battle the hockey mafia to be like, seriously, guys, we could do something else too. And he like took kids to France and
he's one of those teachers.
Yeah, he is actually. Yeah, he was. So that was
my mom was one of those teachers.
Really?
She was like an English teacher who helped people out when they were about to drop out and stuff like that.
Yeah,
in St.
like
John's.
the deeper.
Yeah,
the deeper level.
They get stopped in the mall a little bit more often than
exactly,
your normal. Okay,
exactly.
Yeah. But also a poet, also a jazz critic, right?
No, not a critic. He was a poet, and he wrote his most significant and well-known work is still quite obscure, but it was with Carla Bley, who's a composer who in fact just passed away this month at the age of 87. She's just kind of globally recognized as a really, in her obituary, they called her a provocateur, which I thought was cool, but amazing composer. So he never wrote music, but he was very involved, and I was always listening to this very strange out there music that I thought was normal.
The urge is not always immediate for someone who's the child of an artist to want to follow the arts themselves. In fact, sometimes they can be dissuaded the other way. So just personally, where did that drive come from in you?
Well, I mean, if it comes to rebellion, it's, to write a pop song was about, the most radical thing I could do. If I had like taken up, circular breathing on the saxophone, it would have been really like following the family trajectory. But instead, I scandalized everyone by writing pop music with Jimmy Shaw.
And you started out, my understanding is in classical music.
Yeah, I grew up in Toronto. I was a very good trumpet player when I was a kid, and I got into all sorts of schools in the U.S., and I went to Curtis when I was young and Juilliard. But by the time I got to Juilliard, I kind of knew that it wasn't the right path for me.
You mean you were pretty good to be getting into those schools?
I was really good, but there was something about it that was like came extremely naturally to me. But at the same time, I didn't really understand what I was doing. Like I didn't really practice that much, and I wasn't really like obsessed with it the way that a lot of other classical music kids were.
You were just good at it.
I was just good at it, and I kind of did it in high school for more like social reasons than anything else. Because all my friends were in the orchestra, and everyone kind of played together, and there were like trips for the musicians, and it was kind of more of a social thing, not dissimilar to the way that rock and roll is, And once I got to school, and it was like people were really, really taking it seriously, and everyone's practicing 8 hours a day, and they were probably the most antisocial people I've ever been around. It very quickly became not the calling for me.
How did this happen, the two of you? Musically.
I think the way that it happened, like in terms of like a physical space and musically, is kind of the same thing. We met
Joe Phillips, man.
Yeah, we met through a bass player named Joe Phillips, and he would call me and say, I know this girl named Emily Haines, and she's a really talented singer songwriter, and you guys got to meet. I don't know why he said you guys got to meet, but he kept saying you guys got to meet, and we ended up meeting at the Horseshoe, and there was.
I mean, this is
Yeah,
it's like a maple syrup scented Canadian success story.
Lester B. Pearson was there.
Totally.
We were drinking 50.
Probably drinking
All
50.
the things.
Yeah.
It's such a cool thing.
There was a terrible band playing, and Joe came up to me and he was like, "Hey, that girl Emily I was telling you about, she's over there. Why don't you go talk to her?" So I walked over, and the first thing I said was, "This band's terrible." And she was like, "Yeah, it is." And for some reason, I think we both just went, "Okay, well, let's do something about it."
Did you know when you started playing music together either what you wanted to sound like or what you didn't want to sound like?
We didn't want to sound like that band. I mean, there's always been a pretty deep sense and fear of like regionalism, which isn't any dig on like any particular city. I think you can fall into it wherever you are. But I remember the feeling from that first meeting and connection that it was like, let's do something real. Let's do something big. And I'm sure it's hard for musicians now to grasp how hard distribution was then. That was the biggest obstacle when it comes to like trying to do something interesting. Is it was really, there was not a lot of oxygen in the Canadian scene as we saw it, because it was really rigid with the like satellite offices of these major labels that were just kind of a joke. The like acid wash outskirts of like, you know, these big companies that didn't really seem to respect Canadian music.
Acid wash outskirts. You just said that.
Yeah,
I had those. They had their CDs, and they weren't that bad.
That's not a Soft Skeleton tune. I don't know.
Yeah, right. So we not only wanted to change up what was happening with how you could release your music, how you could reach people, but also Jimmy had all these aspirations of producing and making music in our own way with our own sound that we didn't know what it was. You know, for sure influenced by the music coming out of the UK at the time, like those Portishead records. You know, it was like, what is that? The way that they were creating, it just sounded like it was expressing more than what you would in a conventional, like, you know, officially mandated, recorded, properly recorded facility. It was like the beginning of home recording. So all those things converged, and I think like that's hilariously, we managed to just pursue that pretty much nonstop for the past 20 years.
It sounds exciting.
It's been, I've had a pretty good time, I can't lie.
But the creation of that sound, and I'm not going to harp on this, but I did say this intentionally in the introduction, not just as a joke. There's a lot of bands that wanted to sound like Metric after Metric came out. I mean, I know I've seen a lot of bands that wanted to sound like Metric that when Metric came out. What sounds exciting to me was sort of a rare thing to be able to do, especially in Canadian music, is to kind of define a style for yourselves and to kind of figure out what you wanted to sound like. That does sound very exciting. And
it was self-generating because, you know, we also had absolutely no money. So, you know, it's like, let's scrounge to get together some sort of rudimentary gear at the same time as, you know, Jimmy's developing his abilities. And then, you know, cut to now where we have, like, to me, not the audiophile, but, you know, the beneficiary of that skill, like a state-of-the-art recording studio, which is pretty cool.
Yeah, state of the art. I love that. Someone came into the studio once and they were like, "Can you make like CD quality music?" And I was like, "Yeah, I was going to say that."
We have a plug-in for that.
Yeah.
When you were in New York in like the late 90s, early 2000s, before the first record came out, to me, as someone who is kind of from the outside looking in, and we're going to talk about that a little bit later, but like from the outside looking in, reading music magazines about that time in New York and sort of Williamsburg, and also younger at the time, so like looking upwards and seeing what was happening. The scene that you seem to be a part of there, or the scene that you were making art within there, was a really exciting one. What did it feel like actually on the ground floor of it?
Nothing like it reads now.
Yeah. It never does.
No. I mean, I feel like I would be surprised if, at least for us specifically, if there could be a bigger chasm between how it felt to us and how it reads now anywhere in the world. I mean, really, at the time for us, it was like we were just trying to survive. And it really, really felt like we were just trying to survive. I think that some of the other people in that scene, you know, it may have been a year apart from like where we were living in Williamsburg with the AAS and members of TV on the Radio and Liars and Stars and blah, blah, blah. You know, meanwhile, just across the bridge, you know, the Strokes were like getting it together in a little rehearsal studio in a basement somewhere. I don't think our realities were similar. We were in extreme close proximity to a lot of the stuff that happened, but we weren't culturally that connected to it. You know, after 9/11, we left New York within a month or two, and we went out to LA, and that's really where the band actually gelled and actually clicked, and where we found Mike Andrews and where we found Andy Factor and Ever Loving Records, and started doing residencies at the Silver Lake Lounge, and that's really where it happened for us. The other stuff was like, it would almost, to be totally honest, was frustrating, because the people that were around us and sort of became that whole thing, you know, Mimi in the washroom, as we call it.
Yeah.
You know, is like,
the untold Canadian version.
exactly.
Me in the washroom.
Yeah.
I just got it.
I did Lizzie's podcast, and I said that to her on her podcast. So I was like, dude, I have this idea.
I think they felt like a little community in a different way, in an American way, in a northeastern kind of way.
Yeah.
And I don't think there wasn't a ton of like cross vibes.
But it's funny too with the like how London factored into that. Like we got kind of like chosen. There were these managers that were like, "You're going to be a huge star. Like, drop everything, quit your job. We're flying you to England."
It really does sound like that. This part of the story. It really does sound like
It was
someone was
that.
trying
It
to
was-
like
it was
the
that.
old story of like, we're going to make you big stars. honey,
It
you
really
know?
was.
Yeah.
And in
It's
fact,
just the Chagall that was missing.
seriously.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, my favorite line was like, "The buzz is too big. You can't even play a show. The buzz is so big." From this, like these CDRs that we've been circulating of these, you know, it's all coming back to these CDRs.
A well-known problem. The buzz is too big.
Yeah,
You can't play a show.
exactly.
How many times have you heard that? in
Right,
our
all the
lives?
time.
Yeah.
But
Why
I just
try?
remember everyone saying goodbye to us. Is this like
Yes, I know. Remember it well.
standing and they're all like
They were clapping.
they're clapping
because we left for England,
and everyone was like, "Congrats! Like
You made it.
you made it. You're going." And
It's like when you made it, meaning like someone bought you an airline ticket somewhere
Yeah,
without a
exactly.
return.
Economy class,
And,
Yeah.
to
exactly.
Heathrow.
And the
Yeah.
return was because they didn't have enough money for the return.
Yeah. But you know, when we came back, which was a pretty intense, you know, crestfallen moment, like it didn't result in like the huge record deal, which again, in retrospect, is such a blessing. But
Yeah.
you know, we did this big publishing deal, we did all these things, but it was like we recognized that we had to turn around and come back.
Yeah.
And what we came back to was like in my mind
Right, it
was
had already
was
started.
it had already started, and we came back to this thing we had missed like a year of, which was this sound that was happening in like the White Stripes record and like the garage rock thing. But to me, that was the best, you know, again, in retrospect, the best thing ever, because it was just a context for us to feel confident enough to do what was the right thing to do, which was start a band.
Well, let's play a little bit of the record. It's guitarier than I remember it being. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
So that's Metric and Combat Baby, including my pop-up video commentary during it from their first album, Old World Underground. Where Are You Now? It must have been so gratifying that this record did well then. Like, you know what I mean? I know we're not built for yeah, it worked out, but after everything you just told me, you finally come back, you're making music with friends, you're around people who are making music with friends, you're able to escape this like awful system that so many people have fallen victim to. And then the record does well. Like that record does well. That must be at least exciting or gratifying.
When we did the Mod Club shows on Old World in like 2003 or something, February 2004, and we put up one and it sold, and we put up another and it sold, and we ended up doing 4 shows, and that was the first moment that was like, okay, this is gonna go.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean you feel okay. It doesn't mean you have more than $5.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean you have somewhere to sleep.
Yeah.
It doesn't mean anything other than the room's full, and there's a reason to keep going. And I think that for us, that was the first time it was like, there's a real reason to keep going. Like, this is working. You have absolutely nothing to show for it.
There's a reason to keep going.
Yeah.
That's what it is. It's not that you got something out of it, but you've been given a new reason to keep going.
That's a good distinction.
It's like a lifeline.
That must be a powerful feeling.
Yeah.
I sort of have it right now.
Yeah. I'm not sure we've ever
really
felt
changed.
different like since then, to be honest with you.
Yeah.
Let me play another clip. So I have two songs I want to play before we talk a little bit about the new record. So that's one of them from 2009. That's Metric and Help I'm Alive. Very big song for your band, Jimmy. How did that song change things for you guys, or did it?
We didn't really know how to continue after Live It Out. Like there were problems, and we had taken some time apart and gotten past the 5 years on the road and started addressing all of our own individual stuff and finding out where to live and Emily made a solo record and there was all this stuff happening and we were trying to put it back together so we could really keep going. And that song kind of changed everything. It wasn't intentional at all. Like we had a song. Emily had sent me this song, and we were working on it, and it was slower. And then I came into the studio one day, and I was like, I think I got it. It's got to be like way faster. And I had the whole idea of how to do it, and we did it. And there was this whole thing about this tour that we had booked called the Jingle Bell Rock Tour, and we had to get a song out before the tour. It was like all these problems converged to make us release this song before we were supposed to and choose it as a single when we didn't think it was a single. It was like 25 things went wrong and resulted in the most right thing possible. And we got lucky. And
it was not considered a valuable asset on the record. It was barely on the record.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Because it became the biggest song.
Yeah, and we had to put something out well before the record. It was like 7 months before the record. And because we'd agreed to do this tour, so we put it out, and then it just took off. Like a station in Seattle started playing it.
Someone in Australia.
Triple J in Australia started playing it, and it just took on a whole life. And for us, thank God, because we had gone independent at that point. We were putting out fantasies on our own for the first time. We had rolled the dice big time.
Yeah.
And if the dice had come up wrong, we wouldn't have made it. So that song kind of made us make it.
One more song before we talk about the new record.
I never wanted to go home. One of us will carry a song. There was nothing there for me. Wanderlust will carry a song.
Synthetic is my favorite Metric record. I'm not going to read too much of this look I'm getting from either of the two of you. But Synthetic is my favorite Metric record. And that, for people who don't know, who are listening to this, is the Wanderlust with Lou Reed on backing vocals. And I met you both, and you're not going to remember this, but I met you both when Laurie Brown was hosting this Lou Reed tribute in Toronto, and she got sick like 3 hours before, and I was like 20-something, and they brought me in, and I had to stand on stage and read Laurie's lines for this tribute to Lou Reed in Toronto that you guys played at. I was very sheepish, and I hid away from everybody. So I want to go back to the idea of even the very beginning of our conversation. Emily, you said to me that when your dad's a poet and you're surrounded by countercultural art, the most countercultural thing you could do is to write a pop song. Jimmy, you just told me that Help I'm Alive helps you get this gigantic smash radio success. To me, there's no one who better represents like the conflict between the culture and the counterculture like Lou Reed does. Because on one side of things, yeah, he's like a countercultural hero in the Velvet Underground and the work he did in Berlin and all that stuff too. But he was also making pop songs. He was making pop songs and writing doo-wop songs, and even some of those Velvets and Lou Reed songs are pop songs. So Emily, I know you knew him, and I know you were close, and I know you. He's on this record. Did you learn something from him about how to navigate all that?
Well, we just passed, by the way, October 28th was the anniversary of his passing.
Yeah.
All I know of like what I got from Lou was just it was like I was looked at and heard in a way that was like, for whatever reason, he didn't see the superficial trappings of like, technically it's like I'm this chick like playing the synthesizers and like jumping around or whatever. Everything's sparkly, whatever you want to see, you can see. But for some reason with Lou, he appreciated the writing, and he seemed to understand that I really was unvarnished, and not my main purpose is to just try to find something authentic. So I don't know that that there's anything to learn from him as a sort of role model, other than I felt really like it gave me sort of proof that I was on the right track of the way I've approached my life, and my purpose of like as a writer is that you're just trying to unadorn and just actually say something, not because you're just trying to say something, but because you have something to say. You lived an experience, you learned something, or you have a reason to write a song, And somehow that has connected with Jimmy's ability to be like, what are we, we need to put this in a way that this can be heard and made accessible. And that's where the sort of pop element comes in. And I think that's the thing with the Velvets is like, ultimately the music is just really enjoyable.
Yeah.
Lou also made records that were really challenging for people. So, I sometimes just get a little queasy with the like, grasping how this really is how history works, that everyone looks back and they just can't put a big enough crown on people who at the time like couldn't earn a living and didn't, it's unfortunate that so much good stuff, I wonder what we'll be honoring years later. And then suddenly everyone's so cool and loves this artist that was getting completely, buried.
And I think life is more meaningful when they're real people. When the people who make the work that we admire are real people and they're humans and they have to buy groceries. I find that much more exciting.
Although, getting an email from Lou is very weird.
Well, that's what I'm talking about.
I didn't want him to have an email address.
That's kind of
it really messed me up.
That's kind of what I'm going at, is that you got to spend a little bit of time with like not Lou Reed, but a guy from New York who was that tall and wore clothes.
Lou Reed 2000 at hotmail.com.
Exactly.
I can only imagine there must be, I understand that, you didn't see him as sort of like this vaunted figure playing a scepter on you. You were like, oh, this is kind of at least some validation that the guy who does some stuff kind of like what I'm doing is seeing the things that I'm doing.
Yeah, and then, with the moment that you do get that sense of like, okay, I am in the presence of something of a real substance that I've never encountered, is when we did actually perform together.
Yeah.
Which we did several times, but the Metric show at Radio City.
Yeah, I saw the video
That
today.
was a real, did you, isn't that,
yeah.
Maybe you can see it. There was a really heavy thing where I was like, his eyes, I swear to God, we were singing Pale Blue Eyes and it was like his eyes were changing color and he was shape-shifting. It was really heavy. And then when I talked about it afterwards, he was like, Emily, there's some things we just don't discuss. I was like,
was he cool in studio? Was he good in the studio?
yeah.
He was funny in the studio.
He was funny in the studio. He's just, I'm so crusty now. I can't imagine what I'm going to be like in 20 years.
All right. I want to play a song from the new record, and I want to talk about sort of the where and why of it. Take a listen to this.
We met on the 6th of June, 2002, on the southbound subway. You said what now? The heat's absurd, the rest went unheard, and you already knew my name. I sang for you the softest tune on the 6th of June in the park at Temperley. How's it go now? The saddest June on the 6th of June in the park.
That's Metric with Who Would You Be For Me from their latest album, Formentera II. I love that song, by the way. I really do love it. Can you tell me a little bit about it?
I wrote that song in 2019. I was, surprising no one, adrift. Ultimately, what I guess I arrived at, which I didn't even really realize myself until we released it, which is kind of what happens a lot, right? You kind of hear it for the first time too.
Yeah, and people like me start asking questions about it too.
And just the title sort of, I couldn't decide on a title for a long time, and then grasping that Who Would You Be For Me is actually the point of the whole thing, which is here I am trying to like be like, is it New York? Like, what does New York need from me? What does LA need from me? What does this relationship need from me? Like, what can I do for everybody? And constantly in this mode of like conforming and adapting and just trying to fit in the world and just flipping it finally, at late in the day and at great expense, finally sort of getting the memo internally that you could also approach your life where you consider what would work for you. You could be the girl for me, you know. Who would you be for me? I could be the girl for you, you know. And even like with the city, you know, it's like, okay, New York will take you. All right, well, do you want New York? You know,
What do you want?
Which I mean, I'm sure your listeners are like, dude, that's really basic. But I'm late to the memo, and it's kind of a transformative thing. It can apply to your work and your relationships and pretty much everything if you can just flip it and consider it. And to all of you who are like, you've lived your whole life that way, congrats.
Well, just to stay on that for a second. Musically and production-wise, I can see that as well. I mean, Metric to me, and again, I'm from a rural-y place. To people from rural Newfoundland, by the way, I'm from Toronto. But for people from the rest of Canada, I'm from rural Canada. And I see Metric as a very urban band, a very city band. I mean, what have we been talking about? We've been talking about New York and LA and London and Toronto. And Jimmy, I know like this record was made out in a small town, kind of feels more like music from Big Pink style, you know, like
Totally.
Burn in the middle of the woods.
Absolutely.
Did that bring something different to this recording, or is it just a room?
It's really hard to separate the place from the time on this one. You know, it was like, it wasn't just the countryside; it was the countryside during a global pandemic. So
Right.
These two things are not. They're not disconnected. And energetically, when there's a brick wall, it's like the energy goes towards the brick wall and then it bounces back. And when you were in the country, the energy went out into the trees and it just didn't come back. So it kind of like, you don't reflect upon what just happened. You just kind of end up being like a never-ending well of that energy, and it just kind of keeps flowing out, and it never has to come back to you, and you don't have to think about what you did 5 minutes ago because there's just no reflection. And
That's beautiful.
And in terms of the time, it was the same thing. There was no end to what we were doing. And as it went on, the end got further and further and further away. So it was like we were making music in a space that had no walls and no confinements in a time that also had no confinements. And so the result was we exercised all the muscles of imagination way more than we'd ever done in the past, because there was all the room in the world to do it. And there was nothing coming back at us. There was no like, you walk out of the studio and you're working on a song and a cab goes by with like the new Beyonce single, and it's just like, and your whole thing's
You're
thrown
doubting
off.
yourself.
Yeah, all of a
and
sudden you're like,
wondering,
well, damn it, Beyonce's bass is like out of control.
Yeah,
Where's our
yeah,
bass?
yeah,
you know?
yeah.
Or like, you just don't have any of that reflective quality around you. So you just end up kind of just living completely in your imagination. And I just felt like I had all the space, support, time, whatever it was, to just delve deep and come up with anything. And if it wasn't good, try again tomorrow. And if that wasn't good, try again the next day.
I hope it's really clear how much I love this record. Thanks for doing this.
Thanks, Tom.
The first thing we wrote down, Matt and I wrote down, we were getting this interview ready today, and I didn't say it to you, but you don't seem like the kind of band that looks back, either sonically or narratively. So I do appreciate you doing that with me today. I do really appreciate it.
Your instinct was right. As
Yeah.
Jimmy said, it's been really great to talk with you, because you can imagine doing this with your own life, like
Yeah.
being like, hey, so what have you been up to for 20 years? It's
Yeah.
like, we feel really lucky that you care. So thanks for having us on to chat about it.
Totally.